Good morning and welcome back to the Breakfast Buzz. Today we're going to be highlighting an insect pollinator that is very near and dear to my heart, the wasp. Now, a lot of people don't understand that the wasp is a pollinator. It's not necessarily as efficient of a pollinator as a bee or maybe the other pollinators or other insect pollinators, but it is still a pollinator because it is going to be shifting pollen from one flower to the next, causing pollination of that flower to happen and fruit set actually happening as a result of that shifting pollen from one flower to the next. But it is not out actively gathering pollen the way that bees are. And so I do want to pause for just a second to talk a little bit about bees and what makes them such efficient pollinators. Part of what makes a bee an efficient pollinator is the fact that usually their bodies are covered in branched hairs. They are covered in lots of fuzz, and so when they're going from one flower to the next, they will be picking up all kinds of pollen on their bodies and shifting it to the next flower that they go to as well. Also, they exhibit a characteristic or a trait or activity called flower constancy, which means that they are going to be visiting usually the same species of flower one after another, also ensuring more efficient pollination. And then lastly, they are the only insect pollinator, generally speaking, that is actively collecting pollen because that is what they are feeding their young. So that's something that pretty much all the other insect pollinators that I will be talking about and featuring, they are not necessarily out gathering pollen for their young. They're just kind of stopping by to get a little sip of nectar or something like that, and then they're moving on to the next activity. They do share a lot of similarities as far as nesting habits go. So as bees would be nesting in these human-made habitat boxes, wasps, certain kinds of them also will nest in here as well. And right now I do want to feature a particular little solitary wasp, meaning that it doesn't nest in a colony like things like yellow jackets. You can see a little shine back at you there, a little reflection of something, and that is the face of a tripoxylon wasp, also known as a keyhole wasp. And the reason it's called a keyhole wasp is because of how small it is. They will nest in pre-existing cavities like a nail hole or a keyhole or something to that effect, little nooks and crannies. And this, what we're seeing here, is likely a male tripoxylon wasp. It is hanging out in there basically just to stand guard, while the female is out looking for spiders because they do feed their young only on small spiders. And so the female is out looking for a spider. What she'll do is she'll sting the spider and paralyze it, and then she will carry it in to this little cell or this little cavity, and then she will lay an egg on it, and then she will actually work to partition each cell and kind of repeat the same thing over again, and they use mud to basically partition these different brood cells. But the male, it's kind of an interesting relationship because a lot of Hymenoptera or bee and wasp species don't seem to exhibit this sort of relationship between the male and female, where the male is actually standing guard at the nest entrance. So it's kind of a cool little thing I wanted to highlight here. You can see him moving around in there a little bit, but that's all he does all day, just sits there and stands guard. So it's kind of funny to me, but also adorable. Different wasps have very different nest sort of artistic creations, and this is one of them, although it's been kind of beaten up because it's an old one. This is actually a creation of a potter wasp. It is a nest. The potter wasp will actually go and lay an egg. It'll create this beautiful sort of ceramic pottery kind of nest. It'll lay an egg in it suspended from the ceiling of the nest, and then it will bring in paralyzed caterpillars for that egg once it hatches for the larva to feed on, and then that larva will remain in here through the year till this time next year, where it will emerge and basically create that same cycle again. But they just have such beautiful, unique creations, and you'll find these just kind of attached in random places. You might find them on a garden hose or on a tree limb or on a wind chime in this case. So you may remain unconvinced at the greatness of wasps thus far, but I do want to point out that in the world there are over 114,000 species globally of wasps, and that in the US we actually have about 18,000 species of wasps. When you compare that to bees, we have globally around 20,000 species, and in North America we have about 4,000 species. So when you think of how afraid many of us are of wasps and being attacked by them or stung by them, and then you think of how many species there are in the world and in North America, compared to bees, that we really don't even see most of them. We don't even notice most of them, and yet they're actually providing some really beneficial services to us. One of them being pollination, but that's kind of a haphazard that just happens if they, go from one flower to the next. But actually one of the more important features of wasps is their biological control capacity. And behind me, you'll see a very large, healthy elderberry shrub. This shrub was actually covered by aphids because it's a plant that has extra floral nectaries, which means that it actually secretes nectar from other places on the plant besides flowers. And so it attracts things like aphids. The aphids were swarming this thing going into the springtime. And what then I noticed, which was the same as last year, is that wasps, among other things like flies, lady beetle larvae, were all coming after those aphids and just dealing with them for me. I didn't have to spray this, didn't have to do anything to control the aphids. This was something that was just happening for me, and the wasps were just picking them off left and right, among other things. And so when we think about what good is a wasp, and people oftentimes will ask, well, why is a wasp even beneficial? What is the purpose of a wasp? It's things like that. They are actually quite beneficial to us for things that we don't even notice, because some of them are so minuscule and just completely uninterested in us. So as you may have concluded, since I've been comparing wasps to bees a whole lot and talking about how their needs are very similar, that some of the habitat that we can create for them that's most ideal would involve bare ground. It would involve leaving stems of spent flower heads and other plant debris behind, leaving leaf debris behind, fallen leaves if we can, having grasses nearby. But also when we talk about flowers, it's a little bit different. I mean, we do want to have flowers, so that they have a nectar source basically through the whole growing season. But for them, it's going to be, for wasps in particular, it's going to be a little more important to have shallow flowers, because there are a number of bees that have really long proboscis or have really long tongues, but most wasps are going to have very short mouth parts, very short tongues. And so when you look at a flower like this, Coreopsis, and how shallow it is, this is going to be an ideal flower for them. The hydrangeas out front that are in my front yard also are going to be pretty ideal because they're also pretty shallow flowers. And so, anything that's going to require a lot of reaching, if you kind of walk with me over here to the Clematis. We have Clematis versicolor in the yard. And when you look at this, I don't think I've ever seen any wasps on this flower because they would require a longer tongue or proboscis to actually go into this to get any sort of nectar from it. So having shallow flowers throughout the entire growing season is going to be most ideal for them. And other than that, having bugs for them to actually feed to their young, which if you have bugs in your yard, that's going to be an easy thing. This is actually a little wasp flying around here. Not sure what kind that was. Just went in front of the screen. This is a swamp milkweed seedling, and you can see the aphids that are on it, but I'm not even worried about these because this is going to be some great wasp food. So I'm just going to leave them there. These plants get this every single year. All of my milkweed plants usually get aphids on them, and they never have a problem combating them because there's predators that go after them. So I hope that this edition of the Breakfast Buzz has helped you or inspired you to appreciate wasps maybe a little bit more and to be a little less afraid of them. As was the case when we were talking about bees, an ideal habitat for wasps is also going to include no insecticides if possible. So please try to avoid spraying insecticides at them or at anything else in the outdoors if you can possibly avoid it. So tune in next time for the Breakfast Buzz. We'll be highlighting yet another insect pollinator.